Hello, biology students. I'm recording this so that you can pause and take as much time as you need to write things down, and also so you can do it whenever it's most convenient for you. One thing I do want to tell you, research shows that handwriting will help you remember something better than typing. So you may want to print out a copy of your notes and then handwrite on it. So let's get started. So people just naturally do this, and you do this all the time. You are using your five senses, and you look around the world and you ask questions. So, and that's actually science. We do it all the time. We are all scientists. So we're going to go through and look at some of the science practices. So these are behaviors that scientists engage in as they go through their work. So one big misconception is there is no scientific method. So I know you probably think there is because you did your science fair projects in elementary school, and in middle school you had to learn all of the steps of the scientific method. But scientists, as you saw in that video you watched on how science works, there's no step-by-step process. But there are certain activities that scientists engage in. And science is also very creative. Sometimes people need to look at things in a whole new way and study it in a whole new way to make some big discovery. So let's step through these different processes that scientists use. First of all, they ask questions. They ask a lot of questions. And engineers define problems. So they're curious, or they're inspired by somebody else's work, or they just want to solve a problem. They use models a lot. Sometimes they develop the models, and sometimes they use other people's models. And these models are not necessarily something physical that can sit on a table. Sometimes they're diagrams like this picture. Sometimes it's a mathematical model. Sometimes analogies. You might have done one of those where you said, like, the cell is like a house, or the cell is like a school. Sometimes they're computer simulations, and you're going to use some of those. It doesn't matter what kind of model it is. They're limited. They're simplified, and there's all these assumptions and approximations built into them, which leads to errors. So there is no perfect model, but they really help people understand something more deeply. Scientists plan and carry out investigations. So they have a goal and they have a prediction. Sometimes we call that a hypothesis, but we don't always have a hypothesis in real experiments. Then they plan the experiment and they collect data, and they use that data to support their claim. So I want to tell you about an experiment that I find really interesting. It was a group of social scientists, and they had a goal to look at how does television impact preschool kids. And they did have a prediction. Their prediction was kids who watch public television, so shows like Caillou, they are going to be less aggressive than children who watch regular television cartoons like SpongeBob. So that was their prediction. So they started out by, I should say the types of aggression. So there's physical aggression, like shoving and hitting. There's verbal aggression, so name calling. And then there's social aggression, where you say, I don't like you, you're not my friend. So they started out by talking to parents and finding out what type of cartoons did their kids watch and how many hours per week. And then they started observing these kids on the playground of their preschool. And the outcome was completely opposite of their expectation. They realized that the kids who watched public television like Caillou were way more physically aggressive. Actually, not physically aggressive, but more socially aggressive and verbally aggressive, way more than the kids who watched regular television. cartoons. Those kids that watched regular television cartoons, they tended to be slightly more physically aggressive, but much less socially and verbally aggressive. So this is what happens often in experiments. It just leads to another experiment. So the scientists had to stop and start watching these cartoons and say, what is it about these cartoons that makes the kids who watch public television cartoons more aggressive? And they very quickly realized what it was. So a show like Caillou, the first 25 minutes of the show is some problem. For instance, Caillou goes to the park and kids are shoving and saying mean things like "you're not my friend" or name calling. That's the vast majority of the show is all this aggression. The last 5 minutes is the lesson that the kids are supposed to learn. It's not nice to do those things. You shouldn't do those things if you want to be a good friend. But little kids in preschool, they can't make the connection that the lesson in the last 5 minutes is the takeaway. Instead, they're watching the show and saying, oh, that's a good idea. I'll throw sand tomorrow, or I'll use that name tomorrow. So kids that are kindergarten and over, they had enough brain development to understand that, oh, those last 5 minutes, that's the lesson. Don't do all those things they just showed. So shows you how scientists work through their experiments. Yes, they had a goal and a prediction. Sometimes they're totally wrong, and it leads to more experiments. All right, so they analyze and interpret data. So they collect all this data during their experiment, and then they look for patterns and relationships between variables. And they always have to look for sources of error. What mistakes could they have made in collecting this? Then they use a lot of mathematics and computational thinking. So when you're looking at these relationships, you have to analyze the numbers and see how they're changing or in relation to each other. So lots of math in any kind of science. And then they construct explanations. So they are looking at all of their data. They're looking at the current known explanations and they're applying it to whatever they were studying. And does that explanation work? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't work. And they have to come up with a whole new explanation. And scientists argue a lot. Okay, when I say arguing in science, I don't mean the kind of arguing you do with your brothers and sisters, if you have any. I mean discussions. They're respectful discussions where they might disagree with each other. So they compare their data, they evaluate all the different ideas, they discuss them, and eventually they reach an agreement. And they come up, because of all this argument that they've engaged in, they have a stronger explanation than they would have otherwise. So, and then of course they need to share what they know. So they do a lot of writing about their work. And then they also critically read other people's writing to look for any weaknesses in the studies that were conducted. And if they find weaknesses, they go back to that argument and they discuss with the person who conducted the study what the weaknesses are and why. Now, another part of science, this is on your second paper, we call them cross-cutting concepts. So these are kind of the mental tools that scientists use, or the ways of thinking that scientists use as they go through their work. So you need to write all of these down. I'm not going to read them because you can do that as you're writing. So just pause the video so you have enough time to write. And then these are some definitions. We're going to be using all of these words throughout the entire year. Some of them will be familiar to you, some of them aren't. So just write them down on your paper. Right. And the last part of this is an experiment that we will do in school when we're back in school. All right. Thank you for taking all the notes. I'll see you back in class.